What's good? It's Woog. I wanted to talk about Tony Yayo's comments when he was on Drink Champs with Nori and DJ Effin. They got into a conversation and it became about who was better between Notorious B.I.G, Biggie Smalls, and Ice Cube. And Tony Yayo was taking DJ Effin's opinion that Ice Cube was above Big because DJ Effin is just a huge Ice Cube fan, and he was kind of ridiculing and clowning that position, that Ice Cube could in any way be better than Notorious B.I.G. So if we're looking at both rappers and both careers, it's very difficult to even compare the two. I mean, there are several similarities, which we're going to get into, but it's difficult because Notorious B.I.G. died when he was 24 years old. Like, think about how young that is. Think about the fact that Jay-Z released Reasonable Doubt, his debut, when he was like 26 years old. Jay was 2 years older than Biggie when he debuted than Biggie was when he passed away. I mean, Pac was also super young. He was like 25 years old when he was killed. So I want to start there. It's just a damn shame that we didn't get to see Biggie's career fully unfold. He only dropped 2 actual albums. I know they dropped like the Born Again album after he passed away, and Biggie also had a huge part to play in Puffy's No Way Out album. Think about Been Around the World and I and Victory, that opening verse, and the fact that Biggie wrote so much for Puffy as well. But you know, Biggie's presence on the music landscape, it continued well beyond his passing. I mean, his classics are played till this day. Hypnotized, Going Back to Cali, Notorious Thugs. I mean, Juicy is one of the biggest and most popular, most famous rap songs ever. Just that opening line, it was all a dream. In such a short period of time, Biggie made an immense impact that still ripples through the fabric of hip hop today. So I want to get that clear. I mean, look, I know I'm wearing an Ice Cube shirt, but you know, I've got the Biggie as well. And you know, I was just listening to Kick in the Door 2 days ago. I listened to both of these artists, but it was sort of an immature take by Tony Yayo to just laugh at the fact that, you know, that it's a valid opinion that Ice Cube could be ahead of Biggie all time. I mean, I know that on most lists, if you look at most lists of greatest rappers of all time, you will usually almost always find Biggie above Ice Cube. But let me tell you why it's not totally out of the realm of possibility, nor a invalid opinion, that Ice Cube could be better than Biggie. And look, this is no West Coast bias going on here. I mean, I am on the West Coast. My dad's whole family's from South Central Los Angeles. I mean, they're from New Orleans, but from the 60s on, they were growing up in South Central Los Angeles through the 70s, into the 80s, through the 80s. I mean, my grandpa just passed away in 2021, and he still had his house on 51st Street near Budlong. But I assure you, I'm really coming into this conversation and this topic with a clear and sober mind and a pretty well balanced outlook on this. Now, Ice Cube obviously had a very long career that dates back into like the late 80s, right? So both Biggie and Ice Cube wrote for other artists. Biggie wrote a lot of stuff for Puffy. Biggie wrote for Lil Kim. Biggie was enterprising as a songwriter and then spawning Junior Mafia. Remember when Junior Mafia came out with a rapper's anthem? Players, grab your if you love hip hop, and then, you know, Get Money. Like, that was Biggie basically paving his own enterprise and Puffy allowing him to do so. Ice Cube not only had his solo career, but, you know, since the NWA days, he was writing for, you know, a lot of Dr. Dre's lyrics on Straight Outta Compton, and he wrote for others as well. Ice Cube was a very renowned songwriter. He might have been the second out of that camp after maybe DOC. DOC had a huge reputation as a songwriter at the time. Like, he was supposed to be the next up in terms of promising rappers to watch out for. Then he got in that devastating car accident, you know, tore up his vocal cords, and his voice was never the same after that. It really derailed one of the most promising careers. But, you know, like I said, Biggie passing away at 24 years old totally robbed him of the ability to, you know, drop the 3rd album, 4th album, and so forth. So if you look at the 2 albums that he did drop, Ready to Die, Life After Death, both bona fide classics. Some like Ready to Die more, some like Life After Death more. I could argue that Life After Death is one of the greatest, if not the greatest hip hop album of all time. I know a lot of purists will say Illmatic. They might say Only Built for Cuban Links. They might say, I don't know, Get Rich or Die Trying. They might say Ready to Die. But if you look at the amount of songs that had the staying power and the replay value over the years from that album, Life After Death. You could start with Hypnotized. You could go with Sky's the Limit. You could go with Mo Money, Mo Problems. You could go with Notorious Thugs. You could go with, so many songs, 10 Crack Commandments. From that album, it's almost like a greatest hits album. It's that packed, and it's a double album with very few weak spots. So in terms of, packing the punch per album or even per song, you could argue that Biggie's as great as there has ever been, song by song. And that's largely because, again, it was such a short career. So if you don't like the second half of Ice Cube's career, because he came out, when he left NWA, he had America's Most Wanted, which is probably, it's one of the most heralded albums from that era. It was 1990. So after leaving NWA, penning Straight Outta Compton, he was basically the one you've got to look out for. And so he drops America's Most Wanted in 90. Then he drops Death Certificate, which most Cube fans probably look at that as being Cube's greatest album. Death Certificate. His second album came 1 year later. Then he dropped The Predator and then Lethal Injection in 1992 and 93. So think about that. Biggie dropped Ready to Die in 94, and then Life After Death was released in 97. And it's not like Biggie wasn't busy in the meantime. He had that featured verse on 112's Only You. He dropped, again, the Conspiracy album from Junior Mafia. I think that was like 95. So Biggie was still doing his thing. I mean, I think Lil' Kim's Hardcore came out in 1996. And yes, that was not on Biggie's label. That was on Lance Rivera's Undias label, I believe. But yeah, Biggie was still very busy in 95, 96, but it was like 94 and then 97 are the 2 years that he dropped the albums. 4 years in a row for Ice Cube, 90, 91, 92, 93. So remember when Jay-Z came out, he dropped an album like every year for like 7 or 8 years before he went into that first retirement after the Black Album. Well, again, Cube was 4 for 4 for those 4 consecutive years. And as great as those first 2 albums were, and I think that those are Cube's 2 best albums, his third and fourth album were way more commercially successful than those first 2 albums. So, The Predator was his first #1 album. And for the record, Biggie's Ready to Die peaked at number 15, as popular as a song like Big Papa was. And I used to love Big Papa back in 94. When that would come on the radio, I just loved it. The remix to One More Chance, another classic. But Ready to Die peaked at number 15, and then Life After Death obviously hit #1. It dropped like a couple weeks after Biggie passed away. Weird time in hip hop. But Ice Cube didn't have a #1 album, or at least not a #1 solo album, until his third album, The Predator, because America's Most Wanted peaked at number 19, which at the time was very high for a rap album. Rap albums didn't chart nearly as high as they did, later on in the 90s and into the 2000s and so forth. You didn't have like Drake type chart performance. You almost never had Drake type chart performance, but even like, Ludacris or Big Sean. You could name several rappers today that are more commercially successful than the best rappers of the late 80s, early 90s. It was just a different era in terms of Billboard success for hip hop artists. So America's Most Wanted topped at number 19 on the Billboard 200, and then Death Certificate topped out at number 2, and then The Predator hit number 1. Lethal Injection hit number 5. So Lethal Injection is probably where most people started to say, okay, maybe Cube has already peaked and now he's kind of on the descent, because, that was a heck of a run. It Was a Good Day, that, one of Cube's biggest songs, that was on his third album, The Predator. Lethal Injection had like Tada, How You Like Tada, How You Like Me Now. And it also had one of my favorite Cube songs from that era, You Know How We Do It. It's the one with it sounds very West Coast with the oh yeah. It's the one where he's like, cause I'm that fool from South Central. Thought you stuck yourself with the #2 pencil. And it had kind of a commercially hot bop gun. That was a song, Bop Gun. It took a George Clinton sample, like a lot of the West Coast. A lot of hip hop takes from P-Funk, right? Like we all know that. But, Cube purists wouldn't love the song Bop Gun. Or they didn't love his song with Douse Effects from the prior album, The Predator. Check Yourself. Chickadee check yourself before you wreck yourself. Same album as It Was a Good Day. But even after those 4 albums, Cube was on the movie Friday, right? So that was 95. He also had that Oh Yeah, Throw Your Neighborhood in the Air, If You Don't Care from the Friday soundtrack. And then the next year, he basically spearheaded West Side Connection. And that was after putting Mac 10 on. So Mac 10 already had like Folk Live, Mac 10, belling through the hood with stripes. He already had that like in 95, right? And Cube was pretty much managing that situation. And then he had West Side Connection's album in 96. So that's Bow Down. When you come to, I mean, that was a huge hit in 96. And it also had Mac 10 is the lick, West Side is the click, can't get enough of this gangster. Like there was a lot of Cube spearheaded hotness going on in 95 and 96. So he also had Gangsters Make the World Go Round from that same West Side Connection album. But that, that whole period, just because Cube wasn't dropping solo albums doesn't mean that he wasn't getting busy, right? Like he was kind of doing his thing from a label standpoint, but he was still songwriting, working, also working with, Mac 10, WC, and he spearheaded another group that had a phenomenal album in 95. The group was called Caution. Now, some of you might not remember Caution. They had their single was, "It's the rhythm it takes to dance. You got to live through. So what you want to do? What should I do? Should I bang with the red or should I bang with the blue?" That was a cool song, but the album was called South Central Los Scandalous, and that was basically, Cube's proteges that he was putting on. So Cube did a lot of that, like Biggie did with Junior Mafia and others. So they have that in common. But in terms of solo albums, after Lethal Injection, again, 93, it would be 5 years before Cube would come out with his next album, and it was The War and Peace, Side 1, the War disc. He came out with in 98, and then in 2000, he came out with the Peace side. And let's not forget the Players Club, right? So he had like We Be Clubbin', if we're talking about like pop hits, because I mean, Biggie had a lot of hip hop purist hits, but he also had some, pop fluff, if you will, and that's no disrespect. All artists have their, their share of, we'll say, like kind of poppy hits. So with Cube, it was We Be Clubbin'. It was You Could Do It, Put Your Back Into It. Yeah, I wasn't a big fan of those songs, but they did their thing on the charts. So those singles were between the Players Club soundtrack and then the War and Peace Volume 1 and Volume 2 from 98 and 2000. So Cube was still a viable artist. I mean, the War album hit number 7, and then the Peace album in 2000. So now we're talking over like 12 years into Cube's career. Hits number 3. So you want to talk about staying power, Cube still being a relevant factor in the game in 2000, that should speak volumes, because Straight Outta Compton again was like 1988. So 12 years into his career, he was still doing his thing. So, and in terms of his albums after that, no, I wasn't a huge fan, and no, it didn't have nearly the same fanfare, even though Laugh Now, Cry Later peaked at number 4. That was in 2006. And then Raw Footage peaked at number 5 on the Billboard 200. That was in 2008. So now you're talking 20 years into Cube's career. He was still making quality albums. He wasn't still as relevant in the mainstream of the game as he was before. He wasn't like in anybody's current top 5 at that time. But 20 years into his career, Raw Footage, Laugh Now, Cry Later, even his latest 2 albums, I Am the West from 2010 and Everything's Corrupt from 2018. Those, yes, he was an old rapper by that time, but if you listen to the songs on there, they're still very high quality. They're still very well written. Their messages still resonate. He's talking about current things, and he's talking about it in a way that only Ice Cube can. Ice Cube's been very unapologetic in his stances, and he was a trailblazer. He was super fearless. To leave NWA at that time and to stake out his own path, that was revolutionary at the time. People didn't break away from what was successful, especially in the rap game. So you have to respect the fact that Cube has always been the type who stood on principle, and he was a trailblazer for so many. And again, if you want to talk about the fact that Biggie, a few years later had better lyrics overall than Ice Cube, or whatever argument you want to make, you also have to just appreciate that it was the Ice Cubes that paved the way for, the Tupacs, for the Biggies, and for a lot of what came after that. Cube, again, trailblazing, pioneer, fearless approach to music and to business. And you want to talk about controversial, like Cube was among the most controversial, if not the most controversial artist between 1988 and 1990, 1991. And he did it with different producers. Like usually Biggie would work with Puffy's Hitmen, right? Puffy's Hitmen over the years included everybody from the late Chucky Thompson to Stevie J. Yeah, that's Stevie J. I think he produced like Notorious Thugs. Nasheem Myrick, Derek D. Angeliti, Rashad Smith, I think his name is. So yeah, Puffy over the year had a couple groups of hitmen, whereas Cube in his first album, he was working with the Bomb Squad. That was Public Enemy's producers for that America's Most Wanted album. And then he worked with his guys, basically Sir Jinx and, you know, the different producers that he had around the time of the lynch mob. So Cube worked with his guys, but it was a different set of guys when he made Death Certificate than it was when he made America's Most Wanted. And again, both albums are absolute fire. Go back and listen to those. I just re-listened to Death Certificate like about a week ago. Phenomenal album. And again, from a songwriting standpoint, it was ahead of its time. So all I'm saying is, look, I'm not here to definitively say that Ice Cube was greater than Biggie Smalls. All I'm saying is it's not a slam dunk that Biggie Smalls is better than Ice Cube either, because you really have to take a lot in their totality. But again, I will say this, in terms of verse for verse, song for song, album for album, I don't think it gets any bigger than Biggie Smalls. I mean, his immense presence on the mic, just, you know, the way that he comes into a verse and that overbearing, that baritone in his voice, it just, there's just nothing like it in hip hop. But in the same way, Ice Cube's aggressive approach to the microphone was pretty unprecedented at its time. He had a very unique on the mic delivery as well. So that has to be respected. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are on that whole debate between Biggie Smalls and Ice Cube. There's a lot to unpack, a lot to unravel and discuss, but you have to look at the totality of Ice Cube's career and you have to appreciate his longevity. That cannot be discounted. And in terms of classics, you can say that Biggie had two classics with Ready to Die and Life After Death, even though you could also, again, attribute much of Puffy's success on No Way Out to Biggie Smalls. Again, everything from All About the Benjamins and what Biggie did on that song to Victory to Been Around the World and I. Okay, so Biggie had two classics, maybe three. Ice Cube, again, had at least three classics with Straight Outta Compton, America's Most Wanted, and Death Certificate. But again, you have to go back to the fact that this is so hard to even debate because Biggie Smalls passed away at 24 years old and Ice Cube had an extremely long career. But again, let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love hip hop like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.